We proud these things. Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Today I have the honor and the pleasure to have with me a good friend from Easton, next student of Olives High School, but from then he went up and up and up. I went with all kind of college, all kind of country, been like from Boston to London to Rome to Modena to all those cities. And welcome Andrew Ryan, violin maker of Easton.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you. Thank you to be here. And you know, today we will talk about violin maker, and you are the expert. I'd like to ask you just a brief history about violin, how start and things like that. You can talk over.
Okay, the violin is a bowed instrument. It's played with a bow of some sort that is strung with horsehair. Bowed instruments made their appearance in Europe around the 9th century. They probably came from China. The primitive violins were mostly straight shaped with a hollow box, basically very, very crude, and usually only have one string. Around the 12th century or so, a more sophisticated instrument with 3 strings appears, and it's sort of pear-shaped. And very rude holes cut in, not very sophisticated at all. Those continued for quite a while, and then along came the viols, which were fairly sophisticated instruments, and they were the predecessor, basically, of the violin. The viols had sort of the violin shape, except no corners. They were like this, and then a little C, and then again around like that. They were played with a bow also, but they were played between the legs. Hence, they're called viola da gamba, a viola of the leg. Around the 1500s, 1550, the violin makes its appearance in Brescia, and it makes a spontaneous appearance in its form that we see it today, basically, unchanged. Whereas all the other instruments made a gradual development, the violin pretty much appears just as it is in 1550. The first maker was probably Andrea Urdi, the forefather of a long family of violin makers. Some other Brescian makers were Gaspar da Salo and Paolo Magini, who were also influential in bringing the violin
They developed the best violin, and because I hear through the years those Italian, you know the names better than me. I mean, whereas you can mention the names. I mean, they're really great. Why they're so great? Why they become so popular? And
right. The violin, begun by Andrea Urdi and Paolo Magini and these people, emigrated to Cremona, Italy, as did Andrea Urdi, and began his family, a family of 4 or 5 generations of violin makers, the most famous of which was Niccolo Amati, who lived from 1600 to 1690 approximately. Andrea Amati lived through the, Niccolo Amati lived through the plague, which occurred around the first half of 1600, 1620, 24, which is a very important event. If Niccolo Amati had died in the plague, the violin probably, as a great instrument, would have died out. But he kept alive a tradition that had already begun. He was the teacher of a whole school of violin makers, the Cremona school, which is the most famous.
And it's still until now, I think.
Until
because
now,
you was there.
I was there.
You started there, yes.
Yes. Famous makers from Cremona are most famous, which is Antonio Stradivari. Some other makers, Guarneri del Ceso, there was a whole family of Guarneris, Andrea Guarneri, Joseph Guarneri, Peter Guarneri, and all these makers went out eventually to other cities, to Venice, to Mantua. But the most famous school is Cremona.
Cremona, still.
And still is.
Still until now.
It's very, very famous. The reason these Italian makers are so famous is manyfold. It has to do with the Italian temperament, especially at that time, which is the Renaissance. Not only did they have a long tradition of instrument making, which is very important to have a craft. They knew the craft very, very well, but also they had an artistic sense. They had a profound sense of geometry and proportion. People like Michelangelo, Galileo, sorry, not Galileo.
That's okay. Yeah, Benin and so on and so forth. Yes.
So on and so forth. Many famous artists. Leonardo da Vinci, I was thinking of, who had great talents that encompassed music, art, mathematics, science, physics, all of these things. And that is the violin. It encompasses all of those things. So they were able to bring all of these talents to bear upon the violin, and they brought it to fruition, brought it to its ultimate end, very naturally.
Yep, you know all those, I mean, you've been in different school. I mean, you graduated from Berkeley, you say?
Mm-hmm.
Berkeley, yeah. Berkeley, and then you went in London.
Mm-hmm.
You practice in London how to make a violin, is that right?
Right. I went to school in Salt Lake City and learned how to make violins, and then I went to London to learn restoration, which is another facet of the art.
Another part of the...
Yeah.
And then you've been in Italy and been all
In Italy.
Now you work in Boston? Or you
Now I work in Boston.
in Boston.
For Rayburn
yes.
Music Company. Yeah.
I know you had a really, you spend already your life with music and violin and things. You will
Right.
do.
Right.
That's beautiful. And tell us, when you make the violin, I mean, we start from scratch. You do start from scratch.
Right.
And you buy, in other words, you buy wood. You know, I saw you brought some wood here.
Yeah.
And you can explain to me or to the audience how
Sure.
these things works. Because to me, I look a piece of wood like that. I mean, hey, piece of wood. But I think you can...
The wood is the most important part of the instrument. In choosing it, the maker has committed himself to a particular type of instrument, how the instrument will sound, how the instrument has to be shaped. It's similar to what a painter goes through when he picks what medium he's going to use. Whether he's going to use oil or watercolors or gouache or whatever. He has committed himself to a certain technique and a certain style. Or a sculptor who picks to cut in marble or to cut in limestone or whatever he chooses. He can only do certain things with each material. And it's the same in violin making. So it's very important to pick the proper woods. For the top, spruce is used. Generally, the best spruce comes from Europe, Switzerland in particular. The piece must be aged, 20 years at least. It must have even growth, a good reed, which is the winter part of the tree. It has to grow evenly all year round, not an overly harsh winter and not an overly warm summer. It has to be fairly constant.
And age, you say, age?
The aging dries the wood out so that the water is away and that the wood won't shrink and warp when it's worked. It also must be split out. This piece would come from the tree like so. Many of these pie shapes.
This wood is just a cut and just
It's cut into
special for violin maker?
Special for violin makers, yes. And for the back, again, European wood is used, but in this case, maple. And the maple in this piece is what we call flamed. If you look at it, there's these longitudinal flames, literally, and they undulate.
Beautiful, yeah.
And they give the wood a beauty. The reason spruce and maple are used is that the top needs to be flexible. It needs to be if I show you a violin here, you'll see how they run the same. This is the way the lines of the spruce run, and the spruce runs through this way. It's very weak that way. The wood is somewhat weaker this way than it is the long way. The long way, it's quite strong. If you've ever tried to break a piece of spruce, it's easy to break it this way, to split it. But it's very difficult to break it in half. Okay,
Oh.
so it's very strong this way and weaker this way. That's very important for the top because the bridge has to move. It activates the violin to vibrate that way. The back, on the other hand, must be quite even textured, dense, fairly dense all the way over. So we use maple, which is pretty much the same strength this way and this way.
Wow, that's. Oh yeah, see, you have the piece there. That come from piece like this, and then you do.
Yeah, the
this
violin.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah, this.
the process that we go through to make the violin is that we begin with a form like that. Okay, and that's the basic shape of the violin, but without all the fancy corners and things like that. And what happens is that we take this form and we put blocks of wood in here, which are the corner blocks, and piece here, etc., all the way around. And then we take very thin strips of maple. As you can see here, it's a very thin piece, just like the back, made of the same thing as the back. And these get bent around this form, okay, which gives the thickness to the violin, this is the rib structure.
Yes.
Okay.
But you start from scratch, and how long take to make, from scratch to finish? How many hours? I mean, take a long?
It takes about 2 weeks.
Couple
Two
of
working
weeks?
Yeah, 100 hours or so.
100 hours, something like that?
Yeah.
Depends on.
It depends on the instrument, but pretty much
About
80, 100 hours, somewhere around there.
2-3 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the inside of the violin, so you can see basically what it's constructed like inside. Here are those corner blocks I talked
Yes.
about, and you see how thin the linings are. And here the back it's been set onto the back. On the top, it's a little bit different. On the top we have this bar that runs down the center, which we call the bass bar, and it helps to support the bass side of the violin. Okay, it helps to spread the vibrations which the strings transfer through the bridge to the top of the instrument. As well, there'll be a spruce post that will go in here and connect to the back. And the instrument is all closed up like that.
Wow.
To shape it, after we've made those ribs, we have to shape this arching. Okay, and to do that we use various tools. This is a gouge. You can see that it's curved in profile here. And it has a curve that way and curve that way. And we use that to scoop all the excess wood away from these big slabs of wood after we've cut out the basic shape outline. We use these gouges to clean it away. And then from there we take these very small planes, okay, and we shape the wood this way so that all the arching that is here is not pressed out, but is actually carved from a solid piece of wood.
That's really an art, really.
Yeah. And then to finish that off, because from there it's still a little bit rough, we use very fine, thin pieces of metal that have a little edge on them, a little burr, and we scrape the wood so it's perfectly smooth. Sandpaper is never used.
Never?
Never used. Sandpaper leaves an actually very rough surface compared to scrapers and planes and cutting tools. Because sandpaper does not cut, it scrapes, it abrades. And it's very important in violin making that you cut the wood, that it's sculpture. It's very important to always think of that in violin making.
And you give it this beautiful shine like a brand new there. That's where you use a special painting for that. I mean, that's special made for.
It's we make it. For instance, the Italians. One of the famous thing about the Italians, especially about the Cremona school, is their varnish. The Italian instruments. Many people think that the old instruments sound better because of the varnish that they used. That's a small part of it, but it is a part of the so-called secret of Stradivari.
You mentioned Stradivari. I mean, I know they're famous. Everybody says Stradivari. They sound much better, and why they cost so much?
Because they're so finely made, and the best materials have been used. For instance, Stradivari, as I mentioned, lived in Cremona, and he studied with this fellow Niccolò Amati. He came from a long tradition that had already existed from Andrea Amati in 1550 to Antonio Stradivari, who comes along as a third or fourth generation later, studying with this man who in his day was the most famous, and his father, Niccolò Amati's father, was the most famous. So you have these great artists passing on a tradition. Along comes Antonio Stradivari, who's gifted, we'll say, who already has great abilities in the art. He's a fine draftsman, a fine woodworker, fine artist in general. And he takes all the knowledge that's already come before him, sits down and starts to work on violins. Now his beginning instruments are not profoundly greater than his teacher, Niccolò's. But around 1700, when Antonio Stradivarius is already 56 years old, which is quite old in 1700.
Yes.
That's about when most people were dying, is in their 50s. He goes on to live for another 40 years. And in those 40 years are his most perfect achievements. He took all that knowledge and he went out with it. The varnish was no secret to him, or was no secret in Cremona. He took the best materials, best woods, did the best workmanship, used the finest varnish he could get in that day. And so it's natural that his instrument should sound great. They're also 300 years old, which makes a difference in the sound.
What's
too.
the difference, you mentioned old, between an old violin and the new violin? I mean, what...
There are makers nowadays who make as great an instrument as Stradivarius in terms of workmanship, quality of materials, artistic design. There are people who come up to him, but the instruments are brand new, so they have a new sound. They have a different sound than Stradivarius would have. I don't think it's the day is passing when old instruments are considered greater than new instruments, because people's conception of sound is changing, is always changing.
Yes.
Just as we, in the 30s and 40s, people listened to jazz and swing music, and then in the 60s it was rock and roll, and now it's rap, or people's tastes change. And that's happening in violin playing and music in general. So people they want very powerful instruments now. Instruments with a new voice, a new sounding.
The violin of the 90%, whereas they're all handmade, or there's other way out to do, and what's the difference from $5,000 violin, or I don't know how much it cost. I mean, 300. What is? I don't know. You know the price. I don't know.
Yeah, the least expensive violin would be a few $100s.
$200-$300? Yeah, I don't know.
$300. And that would be an instrument that's entirely made by a machine. Okay.
That's where is the price. That's where it comes.
That's why. There's no personal conception. There's no finesse to the work. As you get more and more experience and art that goes into creating the violin, more and more detail, more and more care, the more expensive the instrument is.
Okay, in other words, if a kid just want to go buy violin, or no, in other words, start learning, you don't have to spend a lot of money. You can just start from
you can buy an inexpensive instrument.
And then gradually after, you can go and buy when in other words, when you know what to do.
Right. It's important in the beginning that the instrument is set up properly, that has good bridge, good pegs, those things that are mechanical things, so that you can actually play the violin properly. The quality of the sound is a lesser ingredient in that.
It depends a lot on practice, on the teacher, or the instrument too, but...
it's very important to have a good teacher. It's very important to practice.
Lots practice, I think.
A fair amount, just like everything else. You can overdo it and you can underdo it. You have to be diligent. Every day you must practice.
Every day?
Every day, yeah. And it doesn't have to be 10 hours a day. A couple of hours is enough if it's intelligent. The most important thing in all work, whether it be violin making, violin playing, is intelligence, intelligent work.
Well, that's beautiful. I mean, how this really works? I mean, I can. If I don't have experience on music, on violin and things like that. How I know the difference between I mean, not say you personally, but I mean, a professional know when somebody play sound beautiful. To me, sound all beautiful, more or less. We can. I tell you the story about my son when he went to school the first day. He came home and say, first week, he said, "Oh, Papa, I learned a new song." And said, "Okay." And we sit there, and I was watching. I said, "Okay, Vincent." And he started to play for 5 minutes. Took 5 minutes to put himself in position. And after we finished, I was waiting, expect something. The first time, I said, "Hey, grab the violin." He said, "Oh," he started scratching like crazy. And I said, "Oh, no." I mean, I expected a little bit better than that, but that's okay. He was a kid. I mean, that's just to say the story about my son, but I think I happen to let a family all the same story. I mean, now these kids, they graduate and then they know how they know they really can do or not. I mean, how the
teacher helps
them. I try to ask you, I mean, how they really know. The teacher can tell? The teacher is honest
whether
enough?
they can play or not? Or
yeah, they can just become at least
a professional?
Yes.
The teacher will basically, but it's also, it's up to the student too. He knows whether he wants to continue as a musician. I think the most important thing in music, in whatever one chooses as a career, is the dedication, the love that you approach to it. That you may not be Heifetz, or you may not be Chrysler, or you may not be the greatest at what you do, but you can be the greatest in your dedication to your art. I think it's a decision that the student makes in the end, whether he wants to continue, regardless, thick or thin, whether he does become great or whether he is poor the rest of his life. He knows whether he wants to be a musician or not.
Can you give a little...
play a little bit?
Sure, why not?
Okay.
Tell us what you play. Tell it for the audience.
A little bit of Bach here.
Okay. Because it can be, we talk about all these things without a little music. Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Beautiful, I like that. Thank you very much and for being here today, and thank you very much to the audience and watch us. And I think we cover pretty good, unless you want to give some advice to a new or old, people who once learn the violin, or if you...
The best thing, if you want to learn about the violin, is to find a good teacher.
Good teacher.
Find an instrument that's set up properly. Find a repairman or a shop that you can trust, and enjoy yourself.
Enjoy yourself.
That's the most
good.
important. Yeah.
The most important. That's good. Beautiful. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
And
Andrea.
thank you very much. And thank you very much. Watch us for next program. We will show some interesting program maybe next week. Thank you and goodbye.